Hello everyone. Today we're looking at some cheap, honest transportation. To understand the Falcon, we have to go back a few years. In the early days, car companies like Ford, Chevrolet, Dodge Brothers built small, simple, economical cars to provide transportation to those with a low income. Around the late 20s, companies started building their cars to replicate the big luxury cars of the day. This was a trend started to boost sales, and at the time it worked. But this thinking continued over the years, and it became a contest to see who could offer the most in their cheapest car. As a result, over the years the cars got bigger, heavier, more options were added. Many options before technology allowed them to properly work, and earned a reputation of unreliability. By the late 50s, they had almost caught up with their big luxury car counterparts, and those who wanted small, economical cars turned to foreign makes. Around that time, American car companies saw the market for such cars and began building their own. Ford's answer was the Falcon. Built in North America from 1960 through 1970, in its first year, Ford sold 500,000 Falcons and became Motor Trend's Car of the Year. In 1961, sales increased to 1 million. The Ford Falcon was advertised to be the cheapest new car in the United States. The Falcon provided for two markets. In its most basic form, it provided reliable transportation for those with a low income. But a list of extra cost options were available to beautify it for those who could afford better but wanted a small car. This particular car was built in November of 1960 at the Kansas City assembly plant, and from various artifacts we found under the seat, a previous owner bought a rebuilt engine from Oklahoma City and attended a Methodist church in Omaha. This car apparently spent a lot of time in the Midwest. How it got out here to sunny California, I have no idea. When I got it, the previous owner was restoring it, and what they mean by restoring it, their boyfriend took the engine apart and let it set for several years before getting in an argument and wanting to get rid of it. And that's where I got it. Since then, it's been a steady, off and on restoration project with the intent to bring it back to its original condition or as close to it as possible. And progress will continue when time and budget allow. If this car could be described in one word, it would be basic. This has essentially everything a proper car needs, not really any more or less. Looking at it from the outside, not much to say. These panels are very thin. There's not much bracing behind them in order to keep the weight down, which makes them very flimsy. It's easy to put dents in them, and there are some parts of this car where you cannot lean against. It is that bad. It is pretty unusual for an American car from this time. Usually each panel takes two men to lift, but you could hit it with another car and it does nothing. This car had the deluxe trim on it, which borders the side moldings. It was only available in 60 and 61. I still have all of it in a box at home. I took it off to start painting it. Now, I was having it painted. I got this far before I realized I ordered the wrong color. I'm not sure what this is. I was trying to duplicate the original Laurel Green, and that will be corrected in due time. Moving inside, this really starts to feel like a car from the early 60s, with this big, skinny steering wheel and chrome horn ring. Now, legend has it the reason the wheel rim was so skinny on these cars was because in a collision it would collapse when in contact with the driver's face. And we have a bench seat, a literal bench seat. This is all one seat from one side to the other, and there's no predestined depression where anyone is supposed to sit, so just really anywhere. It's like a long trampoline. These seats, obviously, have been redone, but were originally done in, I kid you not, green plaid nylon. And if you're wondering how you adjust one continuous seat, the adjuster is on the driver's side, and you move the whole thing. Which is fine if you're by yourself, but with a passenger in the car, usually you pull the lever and the seat just falls back and you gotta communicate with them to kind of scoot the seat forward, and they have no idea what you're talking about. Passenger legroom is really good up front. Not so good back here. But with the seat moved forward, you can equalize the floor space between the front and rear and keep everyone not enough room to be comfortable, but enough room to keep the circulation going. And while we're back here, I want to point out that this particular car has the extra cost rear ashtray. Ford was very proud of this option because it was not available on the Chevrolet Corvair. The instrument panel is pretty basic. We have a rectangle-shaped speedometer, gauges that indicate fuel level and coolant temperature. The coolant temperature gauge ranges from cold to hot. Not very specific, but the pretend gun sight looks kind of cool. The oil pressure and generator output have warning lights that turn on if any of the systems are malfunctioning, theoretically. The turn signal has an indicator light on the right side of the speedometer. Yeah, I can't really see it either. It's really bad. But it's the same light for both left and right, which is confusing because you'd think for the left signal there would be a light on the left side of the speedometer, or if there was just one light it'd be in the center. But that's the way it is. There is a light on the left side of the speedometer. That is the high beam indicator, which doesn't work right now because I took the light bulb out of that to power the oil pressure light. I figured that was more important. Looking at the dashboard, starting with the left side, one thing that's very iconic to post-war Fords is the ignition switch is on the far left side. Obviously it's not here now, it fell apart one day, so for the time being I have an aftermarket one where the cigarette lighter was. You have a light switch, which does a good job being a light switch, not much to say. The wiper control, and the windshield wipers on this car are vacuum powered, and back when they did work, they only worked on high while decelerating. I assume they worked better when they were new. If you're wondering how to power the windshield washers, there aren't any. On the right side, we have the manual choke, which requires some knowledge to operate, but is arguably better than a thermal electric automatic choke that never works. We have climate controls, defrost, vent, and heat. There's no air conditioning on this car. And like I said, aftermarket ignition switch, this is where the cigarette lighter would have been. And I'm honestly not sure where this wire goes or what it does. That's not hot, so it's probably not important. Center ashtray. Another interesting thing about this car is both front and rear ashtrays have never been used, which is very unusual for a 60s car. Or any used car for that matter. Cabin ventilation is controlled manually with these doors under the dashboard. There is one under each side and one small one in the center. The radio was an extra cost option on these cars. And this car did have a radio in it when I got it, but if you look closely you can barely see the marks where the block-off plate would have been, so this car probably did not have one originally. The radio in this thing is absolutely hilarious. It is one speaker, it's AM only, it has variable volume, and that's about it. And best of all, it has vacuum tubes, not transistors, which means you turn it on when it's cold. It takes about a full minute to start working. And when you have to wait that long for your music, it sounds good no matter what it is. If you're wondering why it's outside the car, it's because I took it out to get to the heater, and it's just too much work to put back in. So let's look at the trunk. I love this name badge trunk lid handle, which 61 was the last year for. As you can see, trunk space is about what you'd expect. Not too big, not too small. Now, this particular car still has the original spare tire toolkit, which is kind of neat. This is not a space saver. The tires really are this small. Standard motive power in 1961 was a 144 cubic inch inline 6 rated at 90 horsepower, which is what this car came with originally, and was advertised to have an average of 30 miles per gallon. Available at extra cost was a 170 cubic inch inline 6 rated at 105 horsepower. This car has been repowered with a 200 inline 6 from a 1966 model, which has 120 horsepower. That's a 30% power increase at roughly the same RPM range. Around that time, the 6-cylinder bell housing was changed, redesigned, but some 200s are drilled for both the early and late, which is what this has, which is why I can use the original transmission. Transmission options were a 3-speed manual or Ford-O-Matic, which was a 2-speed automatic. Both had column shifters to maximize floor space. This particular car has the automatic. And if you're wondering why 2 speeds, in the early days of automatics, they had a bad rap for being expensive, fussy, and unreliable, which many of them were. In order to mass produce a dirt cheap yet dependable automatic, one answer was to grossly oversimplify it, and that's what they chose to do. So looking at the engine bay, you can really start to see what I mean by basic. Now, as usual with inline 6s, there's massive air space on each side of the engine, which makes maintenance really easy. It's not the simplest engine I've ever seen, but servicing the components is easy with all this space. Now, this car does not have power steering or power brakes, which in my opinion is a benefit, because cars from this time that have power steering are a nightmare to try to make work. They're made out of components that are made for 1 year or half a year, and nothing's available, and after you get the pump rebuilt it still leaks, and so many of those problems. I have never touched the steering on this car. It just plain works, which is kind of the theme of the whole car. It's not very advanced, but it does work. Now, with the exception of the vacuum hoses and the heater hoses, this is like a mid-size car engine from the 20s. It is just so basic. The carburation is a 1-barrel Holley 1904. The intake manifold is cast into the cylinder head on these engines, which is not very efficient, but it is very convenient. There is no manifold surface to warp or crack, or no gasket leaks at all. It's just the carburetor bolts right to the cylinder head, which is a big delete of a lot of hassle. The exhaust manifold, not so much. Still have all those problems. But that's one convenient thing about restoring these cars is, like a Model T, no matter how bad or worn out it gets, there's just not really that much to fail on them. That's enough figures and facts for now. Let's see how it does on the highway. Starts up just like an old Ford. I think the valve lifters are clanking. It's probably time to adjust them. Now, one of the first things I noticed about driving this car... Yep, one shift. The first things I noticed about driving this car is the ridiculous amount of power the 200 actually has. I mean, these inline 6s are... they're known for being just ridiculously underpowered, and people complain about it. This car is surprisingly... this car moves. I mean, it keeps up with modern day traffic with no problem at all. I mean, it's over the top for an economy car. or a compact car, even by today's standards. The transmission is interesting to say the least. I mean, the bizarre part is the torque converter. This is the true definition of a slush box. I mean, it has a lot of slip in it. It goes about, there's a certain amount of accelerating force it will allow you to have. And beyond that, if you step on the gas any harder, the engine revs higher, but it doesn't do anything. Which you don't really notice on flat ground, but if you're trying to accelerate on a hill, you really notice it. For a while I thought something was broken, but oh, that's the way they feel. It runs a lot better after I hooked up the vacuum advance. The steering has a very, very low gear reduction, which means you have to turn it a lot just to move a little, but it feels like power steering. I mean, it doesn't have power steering, but you wouldn't know it from driving it. The ride is surprisingly smooth and soft. I mean, these really light cars are notorious for being harsh riding and springy. This car is just, it floats like a 3-ton land yacht or something. The engineers did a really good job of giving the illusion that it's a bigger, heavier car. Okay, not bigger, but much heavier car. And the steering, same thing. The only thing that really surprises you is the brake pedal. It doesn't have power brakes. Now, it doesn't take that much muscle to stop it. I mean, not enough to complain about, but enough to surprise you after you get used to all this easygoing ride and control. Visibility in this car is really, really good. This car has the iconic 60s bubble top, which means the pillars are really skinny, the windows are really wide, and they go way up, which means you get a really good view of absolutely everything. Downside is you're never in the shade. You're always in bright sunlight. This car does not really generate excitement. It is very boring, but that's actually very impressive to me, because these super light economy cars are, especially the older ones, are notorious for just being really harsh, really bad riding, really hard controls to operate, and just running rough and a lot of noise inside. The massive amount of isolation from the road and from the engine and all it is very impressive, especially considering there's no carpet on the floor, there's no headliner in this, and the valve lifters are clanking really bad. The biggest noise I have in here is at higher speeds the differential makes a lot of noise. I still haven't rebuilt that yet. So yeah, it feels like what it is. It's not a sports car. It's not a muscle car. Well, actually, this one kind of is because it has the 200, but it feels like a low-price commuter car for people of the low budget that want the bare essentials. It will get you to your destination. So, what is it like owning a Ford Falcon in the 21st century? Well, I'll tell you. keeping this thing on the road has not been without its challenges. Now, we'll start with the bad news. Bad news, first of all, the worst thing about these cars is the lack of parts availability. Now, it's not the most obscure car in the world, I will say, but as many of these were built and as popular as they were and still are, it's really surprising how hard it is to keep one of these running. I mean, now a lot of people out there will tell you it's easy to keep a Falcon running because it's exactly the same car as a Mustang, and that is true with the later ones. These early cars, there is no 61 Mustang, so anything this year is unique to the Falcon, and as a result, not much available. For example, the front suspension, I converted to that of 65 Mustang due to a lack of parts availability, which I made a video series on that. That's a really good example of what I mean by lack of parts. And these Falcon Mustang inline sixes of any year, beginning to end, once again, in spite of how many of them were built and how popular they were, and they do have a surprising following still to this day, there's just not much available for them. I mean, it's really depressing. I mean, when I overhauled this one, I had to get new old stock piston rings from a company I never heard of. And I was fortunate to get those. One shift. The transmission was even worse. What rebuild kits are available are very primitive. There's not really anything aside from seals and clutch discs being available new. I don't know if the microphone is picking this up, but that differential is loud. And it gets very depressing asking for advice from other car enthusiasts. Many people, you ask them about a Ford inline six or a Ford O-Matic or 7.25 differential, and they all just tell you, why? Just swap it with something that works. Luckily, if you do have one of these cars that is complete and in good shape, maybe it just needs a few seals here and there, friction surfaces redone, there are enough parts available out there to keep a nice car nice. So there is hope. On the upside, the Ford Falcon is one of the cheapest and one of the most available 60s cars you can buy today. I'm not suggesting anyone should start with a car this rough. Project cars are always have their challenges, but due to how low cost these cars are, finding a decent one that needs next to nothing is within reach. But being low budget, that is what keeps these cars fun. You can relive the 60s, you can play with these cars, and it doesn't cost you your soul. This engine idles really smooth. It's at 500 RPM. I mean, we have emphasized the performance-oriented cars, the specialty cars of the 60s so much, and have just ignored cars like this for so long that these cars have become a novelty themselves. I mean, it's funny how many cruise nights I've taken this to, or just parked on the street, and people look at it and they're like, wow, that car is all original. That's the way it came. And that's the thing. Boring, nothing cars like this are also part of our history. I mean, we will always remember the cars that we wish that we had, but we don't think a lot about the cars that we actually did have. What are these people doing? Okay. What was I talking about? But don't get me wrong, the specialty cars do need to be remembered. That is an important part of history, but the boring cars that were just one in millions of others on the highway in rush hour that nobody ever looked twice at are also important to remembering the past. I mean, I could not describe this car to somebody who knows nothing about one. I mean, the vacuum windshield wipers, the goofy 2-speed automatic, the radio that requires a warm-up time. I mean, this is stuff that you actually have to live to really know what it's like. And that's one thing that really keeps me interested in this car. I mean, it is a part of our history. It should be saved for future generations to know, to remember. You know, I have been paying no attention to where I've been driving, and you know what? I think I just got lost. So, that is a 1961 Ford Falcon. Or at least one of them anyway. So, until we meet again, happy motoring. The microphone wire is stuck on a tree stump.